The air inside the El Capitan Theater was its usual blend of laughter and warm studio light, that familiar cocktail of showbiz charm and practiced spontaneity. The band played a jazzy, up-tempo Motown tune as the crowd, locals, tourists, die-hard fans settled into their seats, buzzing with the easy promise of late-night entertainment. On cue, Jimmy Kimmel stepped into the glow, his trademark grin flashing, half mischief, half muscle memory. He launched into his monologue, a quick-footed mix of politics and punchlines, delivered with the confidence of a man who'd danced this dance 1,000 times. Backstage, the mood was different, quieter, focused. Denzel Washington stood with the calm composure that always preceded his entrance, dressed in a dark, tailored suit that caught a soft charcoal sheen under the hallway lights. His team hovered close, a publicist, 2 assistants, each speaking in low tones. He was there to discuss his new film, a restrained, deeply personal drama about a father and son navigating years of silence and pride. Critics had already called it a masterclass in restraint, murmurs of Oscar potential trailing its early screenings. Denzel, who had both directed and starred, took pride not in the buzz, but in the story itself, one that spoke to broken people trying in imperfect ways to heal. A production assistant poked her head through the doorway. 5 minutes, Mr. Washington. He nodded once, graciously. How's Jimmy tonight? His publicist smiled, a little too tight. Polished. Maybe a little punchy. Punchy, he repeated, one eyebrow lifting. Before she could elaborate, a young camera operator, coffee in hand, too close to the cables, added, He's got some zingers lined up for you tonight. Wants to shake things up, loosen the tie. There was a beat. Denzel didn't frown, not exactly. But something in his eyes shifted, a quiet recalibration. He reached for a bottle of water, took a slow sip, and nodded. From the stage, the applause sign blinked to life. The band swelled. Kimmel's voice echoed through the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome an Academy Award winner, one of the greatest actors of our time, the one and only Denzel Washington. The applause was thunderous. Denzel stepped into the light with the same calm gravity that defined him on screen. He waved once, smiled, and crossed the stage with the unhurried poise of a man who never needed to chase attention. Jimmy met him with arms open, an embrace that felt just a little too big, a little too staged. Denzel returned it, warm but measured. Man, it's good to have you here, Jimmy said, settling behind the desk. Been looking forward to this. Appreciate the invite, Denzel replied. Always enjoy our chats. Congratulations on the film, by the way, Jimmy said, grinning. Saw it last weekend, had me tearing up like a baby. It's powerful stuff. Thank you, Denzel said, folding his hands. It's a story I've wanted to tell for a long time. Something quiet, something honest. Jimmy tapped his cue cards lightly. Honest. That's a good word for it. The pause after that word was just a little too long. The audience didn't notice, not yet. But backstage, Denzel's publicist did. She knew that tone, the kind that didn't use honest as praise but as a setup. Jimmy shifted gears, sharing a story about his own father. The crowd laughed, tension dissolving, at least for them. Denzel, ever composed, caught the undertow. Conversations like these had rhythm, and this one had just gone slightly offbeat. It wasn't in the questions, not yet. It was in the grin that lingered a second too long, the unnecessary shuffle of cards, the faint sense that tonight, the host wasn't just chasing laughs. He was chasing something louder. Denzel sat a little straighter. The interview began as expected. Laughter, rhythm, ease. Jimmy leaned back, tossing out jokes with effortless precision. He teased Denzel about his discipline, his legendary seriousness on set. Denzel played along, polite, smiling. He even chuckled when Jimmy imitated his director face. Brow furrowed, arms crossed, silent behind the monitor. Jimmy said, glancing at the audience with a conspiratorial grin. I watched this film and thought, if I'd had a dad like that growing up, maybe I wouldn't have spent high school trying to impress my therapist. The crowd erupted. Denzel smiled, just enough. That kind of controlled grace that left you guessing whether it was amusement or generosity. Jimmy pressed on. It's a powerful performance. This father figure, this moral center. He's flawed, sure, but grounded. The kind of man you want to believe still exists. And coming from you, it feels authentic. The word authentic lingered heavy. Denzel caught it. His posture didn't change, but his eyes cooled. Jimmy continued, voice softer now. Here's a man who stands by his values even when it's hard. Tries to guide his son without forcing him. Tries to show, not tell. That was the point, Denzel said evenly. To show a man who's not perfect but trying. Trying to love better. To break a cycle without losing himself. Right, Jimmy said, pretending to glance at his cards before looking up again. And speaking of values, I heard you were asked to speak out in support of that reproductive rights bill a while back, and you passed. Said it wasn't your place. That must have been a tricky decision. The shift was immediate. The laughter drained from the room. The audience didn't know whether to clap, laugh, or hold their breath. They chose silence. Denzel looked at Jimmy, expression unreadable. I'm here tonight to talk about a film, he said calmly. A story about healing, not politics. Sure, Jimmy said, raising both hands in mock surrender. Of course. I get it, Jimmy said, palms up, voice light but eyes locked. But I just think it's interesting. You play this principled man on screen, a father who fights for his family, stands up for what's right. But when it comes to real-world issues, ones that affect millions of women, you stay neutral. Doesn't that feel like a contradiction? Denzel didn't flinch. I don't think being an actor means I owe the world a public position on every issue, he said evenly. Especially when those positions are framed to turn complex human experiences into sound bites. Jimmy leaned forward, the grin fading from his face. But don't you think silence can sometimes be taken as complicity? You've got this incredible platform. People listen to you. I'm aware, Denzel replied. His tone was calm, unyielding. And I use that platform to tell stories that matter. Stories that reach people's hearts, challenge how they think. I'm not running for office. I'm trying to make art. The air in the studio thickened. Not loud, not explosive. Just tight, like a wire stretched between 2 points. Jimmy smiled again, but it didn't reach his eyes. There was something sharper now, something testing. I guess I'm just wondering, he said, voice softened by faux curiosity. Where that line is for you, between the artist and the citizen. Because for a lot of people, those lines are blurred, especially now. Denzel nodded slowly. I understand that. But the moment we demand artists become spokespeople for every cause, we risk turning their voices into performance. People don't need my opinion on every issue. They need truth. And sometimes, he added, the truth lives in the silence between statements. A small murmur rippled through the audience. A cough, a restless shift of a seat. Jimmy glanced down but didn't reach for his cue cards this time. I hear you, he said. I do. But I also think you're Denzel Washington. You're not just anybody. Your silence matters. Denzel leaned back composed. And so does the intention behind that silence. I speak when I have something worth saying. Something that helps. Not when I'm pushed into it for ratings or applause. There it was. The jab, wrapped in civility. Jimmy blinked, regrouped, then laughed a little too quickly. Whoa, all right, that one's going viral. The audience chuckled, grateful for the release. But the warmth didn't return. The easy rhythm of late-night charm had frayed. What replaced it wasn't confrontation, not yet, but a tension that hummed just below the surface. Two men sat across from each other, each realizing the other had brought a different definition of honesty to the table. And Denzel, who'd come to talk about healing and redemption, was starting to realize that tonight, he was the story. Whether he'd agreed to be or not, Jimmy's smile didn't falter, but his eyes flicked toward the wings. A subtle check with the producers. They were still rolling. The red light on the main camera blinked steady and merciless. The audience leaned forward now, quieter, more alert. The kind of silence that fills a room just before something tips. So, Jimmy said, reaching under the desk. He pulled out a tablet, already queued up. This made the rounds a few years back. Maybe you remember it. He tapped the screen. Behind them, the massive monitor flickered to life. The sound came in gradually. A grainy phone video, Denzel on stage at what looked like a church or a university hall. His tone was calm, deliberate. We've forgotten what it means to raise a family with structure, he was saying. A father and a mother. Respect, discipline, love, yes, but responsibility too. That's how I was raised. That's how I raised my kids. The clip ended abruptly. The silence that followed wasn't accusatory exactly. It was loaded. Jimmy let it breathe. Then lightly, That was from 2015. You were speaking at an event for a faith-based education group. Pretty passionate words. Denzel's face didn't move. No smile now. Do you stand by that today? Jimmy asked. That whole father and mother structure? Some people thought it sounded exclusionary. I was speaking about my own experience, Denzel said evenly. The way I grew up. The values that shaped me, that's not a prescription for anyone else's life. It's not law. It's memory. Jimmy nodded, weighing the words like a poker player eyeing a bluff. But you see how that might rub people the wrong way now, right? Families look different these days. Denzel's jaw shifted, subtle, controlled. His voice dropped a register. Jimmy, if you're trying to stir up a scandal so you can trend for 24 hours, I'm not your source. The studio went still. Not dramatic, just absolute. Even the band froze, hands hovering over instruments. Jimmy blinked, his smile faltering for the briefest beat. I'm just asking questions, he said. The defense too quick, too polished. There's a difference, Denzel replied, leaning forward, hands resting on his thighs. Between asking questions and setting traps. And I've been around long enough to know the difference. The tension deepened, took root. You could feel it in the air, in the audience holding its breath, in the camera crew's silence, in the way even laughter now felt dangerous. Jimmy tried again, quieter. I think people just want to understand. When someone like you, respected, admired, talks about values but avoids taking stances, it can seem like you're dodging. Picking and choosing, Denzel repeated, eyes narrowing slightly. You mean not stepping into every political minefield someone else lays in front of me? Jimmy's laugh came out thin, brittle. I mean, you're a storyteller, a truth teller. Don't people deserve the whole truth? Denzel's reply came without hesitation. I think people deserve to be treated like adults. To hear a story, reflect on it, and come to their own conclusions. They don't need me telling them what to think. That's not truth, he paused. That's agenda. The silence after that was absolute. You could hear the low hum of the ceiling lights, the shuffle of one uneasy foot in the audience. Jimmy adjusted the mic on his lapel, clearing his throat. But you don't think it's a cop-out? He asked, his tone careful now. To say nothing, to stay neutral? There's a difference between silence and neutrality, Denzel said, and another between neutrality and dignity. I came here tonight to talk about a film that asks people to feel, to reckon with their own lives. And instead, you're dissecting words from nearly a decade ago like they're courtroom evidence. It's just context, Jimmy said, though the confidence was already slipping, the rhythm gone. No, Denzel replied quietly but firmly. It's theater. You're staging conflict for applause. I'm not interested in that. Jimmy's lips parted, but nothing came out. I've spent 40 years building a career that speaks through craft, Denzel continued. Not through sound bites. Not through outrage cycles. If people want to understand my heart, it's in my work. He paused, eyes still locked on Jimmy's. Not angry, just done. And if that's not enough for your show, then maybe I'm in the wrong chair. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They landed, quiet, heavy, final. From somewhere in the crowd, one person clapped. Then another. A slow, uncertain rhythm. Not applause, not silence either. Jimmy glanced off stage again. Someone behind the camera mouthed something. He gave a small nod. Well, he said, trying for casual, but the tone faltered. Let's take a quick break. We'll be right back. The band played them out, but it didn't sound like music. It sounded like noise. Something to fill the space where no one knew what to say. When the cameras returned, everything looked the same. The light still glowed warm and soft. The band smiled faintly. The audience applauded on cue, but without conviction. Yet something had changed. The stage was still a set, the desk still a prop, but now everyone in the room knew the script was gone. Whatever this was, it wasn't entertainment anymore. Jimmy leaned forward, elbows on the desk, a forced smile tugging at his face. Denzel sat still. Not tense, not defensive, just grounded like a man who knew he was no longer being interviewed but tested. So, Jimmy said, carefully casual. Before the break you mentioned something about agenda versus truth. Denzel nodded. Sure, Jimmy continued, his tone sharpening slightly. You say you make art, not politics. But your film, it is political. It's about justice, about healing generational trauma. That's social commentary. People connect with it because they want to believe redemption is possible. But wouldn't that message land stronger if it came from someone willing to take a real stand? Not just on screen, but out here in the world? Denzel didn't flinch. He looked like a man who'd been expecting the question all along. "You want me to fit your script?" he said evenly. "To perform what you think a principled man should look like. But here's the thing, Jimmy. Faith, conviction, integrity, they don't need spotlights. They don't need hashtags or applause to be real." Jimmy's smile faded completely. "But they need action, don't they? You can't play a man fighting for justice and then stay silent when people are actually out there fighting for it. That's a disconnect." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Not outrage, just tension. "You think standing beside someone means posting a statement online?" Denzel asked, voice calm, steady. "I think it means living with integrity every day, being faithful to your family, treating people with decency, hiring responsibly, mentoring young artists, giving opportunities to those who've never had them. That's how I take a stand," Jimmy leaned in. "And what about using your voice when it really matters? When laws are being passed that affect lives? You're a public figure. You can't act like what you say or don't say doesn't matter." "I'm not acting," Denzel said, his tone firm but controlled. "You are. You're performing outrage because it plays well with your base, because it makes you look righteous. But my values aren't here to be put on trial for late-night ratings." The room went still. Jimmy's jaw tightened. "So you won't speak on any of it? Not women's rights, not racial justice, not LGBTQ issues? You're just above it all?" "No," Denzel said. "I'm not above anything. But I won't be reduced to a mouthpiece either. I'm not a politician. I'm not a preacher. I'm a man who believes in doing the work with intention and care. I won't let you cheapen that because you want a viral clip." Jimmy didn't back down. His voice rose slightly, the trained indignation creeping in. "But isn't silence its own message? Isn't it privilege to say nothing while others fight just to be seen?" Denzel exhaled, slow and heavy. "You don't know what I do when the cameras aren't rolling. You don't know who I mentor, who I feed, who I protect. You only know what makes it to your timeline." He turned slightly, looking toward the audience, then back to Jimmy. "You want a message?" he said. "Here's one." He gestured toward the camera, his voice cutting clean through the air. "If this ambush, this performance of accountability, is how Hollywood treats the artists who've spent their lives telling meaningful stories, then that's not progress. That's not courage. That's a shame." The words landed like a weight. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was electric. Jimmy blinked, thrown off balance, the control slipping for good. He tried to recover. "Look, I'm not trying to shame you. I just think people deserve to know who they're supporting." "They already do," Denzel said. "They know through my work, through my life, not through forced declarations under studio lights." And for the first time that night, Jimmy had no follow-up. Jimmy leaned back slightly. "But don't you see how it looks?" he said. "You make a movie about redemption but won't speak out on the real things people need redemption from." Denzel's reply came without hesitation. "Redemption doesn't come from press statements. It comes from reflection, from change, from action that doesn't need to be seen. You're looking for headlines. I'm looking for healing." There was nothing more to add. Not for the audience, not for the band, not even for Jimmy. The air had shifted. They weren't watching an interview anymore. They were witnessing something heavier. Two men, both with platforms, both with voices, but only one with the quiet confidence of someone who doesn't need to raise his voice to be heard. In the control room, a producer stared at the monitors and realized they weren't directing a talk show anymore. They were broadcasting a reckoning. Jimmy's tone turned clinical, not curious, not conversational. Each word was deliberate, like evidence being presented. He leaned forward again, elbows on the desk, eyes narrowing slightly. "So let me ask you this," he said, careful but pointed. "Do you believe silence in the face of injustice is complicity? Because that's what a lot of people feel, that saying nothing is a choice and it hurts." Denzel didn't answer right away. He sat still, hands resting loosely on his lap, posture composed but not defensive. The studio held its breath. The audience wasn't sure whether to clap, gasp, or stay perfectly still. Finally, Denzel turned his head toward Jimmy, not angry, not defiant, but resolute. "You keep coming back to this idea," he said slowly, that silence is weakness. That not giving you a quote means I lack courage. But maybe, Jimmy, maybe the real cowardice is needing applause to feel righteous." Jimmy blinked, his grip tightening around the cue cards. Words matter, Denzel continued, his voice calm but carrying each syllable precise. But only when they come from truth. Not when they're dragged out under pressure. Not when they're used as weapons or bait. He paused, then added softly but with unmistakable weight. Words are powerful, but only when they're chosen, not extracted. A murmur rippled through the audience and a quiet acknowledgement, the sound of understanding sinking in. Jimmy straightened, his composure flickering. He tried to recover, slipping back into his usual tone of righteous demand. But don't you think people deserve more than art? He pressed. Don't they deserve a voice that stands beside them, that fights for them? Especially from someone who claims to stand for values? That was the breaking point, the moment the needle cut too deep into the record. The breath before the glass shatters. Denzel sat back, exhaled once, then rose. Not abruptly, not in anger, but with the calm of a man who knows exactly who he is and no longer needs to prove it. He buttoned his jacket, the quiet click somehow louder than Jimmy's question. When he spoke, his voice filled the room, not loud, just steady. I came here tonight to talk about a film, he said. A story about healing, about forgiveness, about men learning to love better. He looked out at the crowd, not accusing but sincere. I didn't come here to be interrogated, or boxed into sound bites, or turned into a symbol for someone else's argument. He turned back to Jimmy, who sat frozen behind the desk. You wanted a moment, Denzel said. Something viral. Something that could be clipped and passed around like a trophy. His voice softened. Intimate now. But let me leave you with this instead. He looked toward the camera as if addressing the millions watching beyond the lights. Words are necessary, he said. But not when they're forced. Not when they're twisted for spectacle. The truth doesn't need a spotlight, and it needs a soul. He paused, the silence stretching through the studio. Then almost gently he added, and sometimes the most honest thing you can say is nothing at all. He turned to leave, then stopped once more, looking back at the crowd. I came here to share art, not to be dissected, not to be turned into content. He glanced at Jimmy. I hope you find what you're really looking for. And with that, he walked off stage, no dramatics, no anger, just dignity. No one clapped. Not because they didn't want to, but because it didn't feel right. It wasn't an exit. It was a statement. A refusal to let his humanity be reduced to a headline. Jimmy sat motionless, hands flat on the desk, mouth slightly open, as if reaching for the next line, only to realize the teleprompter was blank. In the control booth, the producers hesitated. No one knew whether to cut to commercial or let the silence roll. Someone whispered, Jesus. No one laughed. Backstage, Denzel walked calmly toward the exit. His team followed in silence, no phones, no panic, no spin. There was nothing to spin. The moment had already spoken for itself. By the time the East Coast broadcast ended, the internet was already on fire. Within minutes, hashtags began to spread. Geared, Denzel walks out. Kimmel ambush, one talk show meltdown. At first, the clips were short, a 30-second snippet of Denzel standing up, a shaky phone video capturing the stunned silence. Then came the full segment, the analysis videos, the breakdowns, the think pieces. Celebrities weighed in, actors, directors, musicians, even studio heads. Some simply posted a heart or prayer emoji. Others were direct. Denzel Washington is a class act. He didn't storm out. He walked away with grace. That matters. Trade outlets called the exchange uncomfortable, unnecessary, avoidable. But not everyone agreed, and the conversation was only beginning. A second wave of reaction rose just as fast, this time in defense of Kimmel. His supporters cast him as the one speaking truth to power. Hashtags like, your Kimmel held him accountable and I silence his complicity trended alongside the outrage. A handful of progressive commentators on YouTube and Instagram reposted the clip, accusing Denzel of hiding behind ambiguity and avoiding moral clarity. Being apolitical is a luxury, one caption read. Others applauded Kimmel for asking the questions other hosts were too afraid to touch. Yet the louder conversation wasn't about who was right. It was about the moment itself, what it revealed, what it meant. A headline on one aggregator declared, "Talk show turns tribunal, when late night stops being funny." Another op-ed ran under a quieter title, "Denzel didn't walk out, he walked through fire." Within hours, think pieces poured in from every direction. Cultural critics dissected the ethics of political confrontation in entertainment. Media scholars debated whether late-night shows had become stages for viral morality plays. Former producers shared insider accounts of how often guests were prepped, softened, or misled about the tone of an interview. And through all of it, Denzel said nothing. No tweet. No press statement. No carefully crafted response. His team sent one line to every outlet that reached out. Mr. Washington stands by his words and is focused on the release of his film. The absence of spin only fueled the noise. His silence became its own kind of statement. Measured, grounded, immovable. It felt as though he'd already said everything that needed saying. As though the moment now belonged not to commentary but to memory. Inside studios and boardrooms, executives watched the footage differently. Not for scandal, but for precedent. What had unfolded between Kimmel and Washington wasn't just tension between two men. It was a glimpse into the widening gap between performance and principle. People started asking harder questions. What does it mean to invite someone for conversation and then interrogate them? Where's the line between accountability and ambush? Between entertainment and exploitation? Even casual viewers found themselves replaying the clip. Not for drama, but for the stillness. The charged, haunting quiet when Denzel stopped speaking. One journalist described it best. This wasn't a meltdown. It was a moment of clarity. And that clarity lingered, unsettling and unshakable. It left everyone asking, who decides how truth is delivered and what kind of truth do we really want? 3 days later, at the film's premiere in Westwood, Denzel arrived with quiet composure. Cameras flashed, microphones reached, but he carried the same calm gravity that had defined him for decades. When asked if he had anything to say about the Kimmel exchange, he offered a single line, "The art speaks loud enough." He smiled, posed for a few photos, and walked inside. As the lights dimmed and the film began, the audience seemed to watch it differently now. It wasn't just a story about fathers and sons. It was a reflection of conviction of a man unbent by noise. Every line, every silence, every look carried new weight, not born of controversy but of truth that refused to bend for convenience. The movie opened strong. Critics praised its stillness, its honesty, its emotional restraint. None mentioned the interview directly, but their words carried the same refrain. Quiet power is still power. Meanwhile, back at late night, something had shifted. For 2 nights after the incident, Kimmel's show aired like a shadow of itself. No direct address, no jokes about it, just an uneasy neutrality. The rhythm was gone, the confidence muted. The air felt thinner, audiences noticed. So did the internet. Was he avoiding it? Rethinking it? Regretting it? Then came a small column in the New York Times, buried deep in the Sunday culture section. The headline read, "Sometimes the person who walks away is the strongest one in the room." It didn't name names. It didn't need to. It spoke of restraint, of grace, of the quiet dignity that lives inside silence. And somewhere between those lines, readers understood. This was never really a story about television. It was about character, about how a man chooses to stand when the lights burn hottest. And when the noise faded, what remained was that silence, unmoved, unbroken, undeniable.